On the evening of January 6, 2007, in Knoxville, Tennessee, a young couple, 21-year-old Channon Christian and 23-year-old Christopher Newsom, were planning to spend a simple evening together, a quiet Saturday night filled with nothing more than laughter, dinner, and the comfort of each other's company. They were young, in love, and full of promise. Channon, a senior at the University of Tennessee, was a beautiful, intelligent young woman who came from a loving family. She was studying sociology, driven by a deep desire to help others and build a meaningful life. Chris, a former high school baseball star, was described by those who knew him as warm, friendly, and respectful. He worked hard, loved his family, and had a magnetic smile that made people instantly feel at ease. They had been dating for a couple of months, and by all accounts, they were the kind of couple that others admired. Happy, genuine, full of life. But in the blink of an eye, their lives were stolen in one of the most brutal and senseless crimes the state of Tennessee had ever seen. That night, Chris picked Channon up in her Toyota 4Runner from a friend's apartment complex. It was around 8 p.m., and the two had plans to go out for dinner. As they sat in the parking lot, likely talking or getting ready to leave, they were ambushed. Without warning, their vehicle was surrounded by a group of strangers, 5 individuals armed with weapons, anger, and a cruel plan. The attackers, Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd, forced the couple at gunpoint into the back of the car and drove them to a small, rundown rental house at 2316 Chipman Street, just a few miles away. It was a house with no warmth, no comfort, just peeling paint, broken furniture, and, on that night, pure evil. The next 36 hours would become a living hell for both Channon and Chris, filled with unspeakable torture, degradation, and horror. Upon arrival at the house, Chris and Channon were separated. Chris, bound and blindfolded, was raped and beaten. His last hours were spent in terror, stripped of his dignity, tortured by people who saw him as nothing more than a plaything for their rage. Eventually, he was dragged out of the house, barefoot, led through the cold night air to nearby railroad tracks. There, he was forced to kneel before being shot 3 times, once in the neck, once in the back, and finally, execution style, through the head. His body was then set on fire in a final act of cruelty, as if his life, his dreams, and his memory could be erased by flame. His remains were later found, charred and discarded like trash beside the tracks. But for Channon, the nightmare was only just beginning. Held captive inside the house, she was repeatedly raped by multiple assailants over a period of more than 24 hours. She was beaten, urinated on, and degraded. The attackers poured bleach down her throat and on her body, in an attempt perhaps to destroy DNA evidence, but also an act so callous and cruel that it defies explanation. Eventually, her body was wrapped in trash bags, her face covered, and she was stuffed, still alive, into a trash can in the kitchen, where she slowly suffocated to death. It was a death marked not only by physical pain, but by sheer terror, by loneliness, and by the knowledge that no one was coming to save her. Meanwhile, her parents, Gary and Dina Christian, were growing increasingly worried. Channon hadn't returned home. She wasn't answering her phone. She had always been reliable, communicative. This wasn't like her. They called the police and began searching immediately. As hours turned to days, their desperation grew. Flyers were posted, calls were made. Friends and strangers joined in the search. The Newsom family, too, was gripped by panic. Chris had disappeared, and something felt horribly wrong. On January 7th, Chris's burned body was discovered near the railroad tracks. The details were horrific, but investigators knew immediately that this was not just a murder, it was something far worse. 3 days later, police traced Channon's vehicle to the Chipman Street house. Inside, they found her body stuffed in the trash can, wrapped in garbage bags, barely recognizable. The crime scene was a horror beyond comprehension. Blood, bleach, restraints, evidence of long, drawn-out suffering. The community was shaken. Knoxville, a relatively quiet city, had never seen anything like this. As news spread, so did disbelief, then anger, and finally sorrow. 5 suspects were quickly arrested. Lamarcus Davidson, a recently released felon, was identified as the ringleader. Latavius Cobbins, his half-brother, and George Thomas were found to be deeply involved. Vanessa Coleman, Cobbins' girlfriend, claimed to be a bystander but was found complicit. Eric Boyd, initially charged only as an accessory, would later be convicted as a direct participant. The trials revealed the extent of the brutality. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of events, each cruel act, each horrific decision. Witnesses cried on the stand, jurors wept. Even hardened law enforcement officials struggled to describe the depravity. Davidson was sentenced to death. Cobbins and Thomas received life without parole. Coleman was convicted on lesser charges and eventually granted a retrial. She was again found guilty, but served a significantly reduced sentence. Boyd, the final defendant to be tried, was convicted in 2019 and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 90 years. But the trials, though necessary, were grueling for the families. They were forced to sit through graphic testimony, to listen to autopsy reports, to see crime scene photos no parent should ever witness. And they endured it all with grace, determination, and unimaginable strength. The Christians and the Newsoms channeled their pain into action. They spoke publicly about the case, advocated for victims' rights, and worked to ensure that Channon and Chris would not be remembered only for how they died, but for the lives they lived. The case also sparked national debate. Some critics questioned why the crime hadn't received more media attention, pointing to the racial dynamics, 5 black suspects and 2 white victims, as a possible reason for the relatively muted national coverage. Others argued that the case was too graphic, too painful for mainstream media. Regardless, for those in Knoxville and for true crime followers across the country, the story became a symbol, not just of evil, but of courage, of justice, and of enduring love. In the years since, Channon and Chris have been honored in countless ways. Scholarships were created in their names. Candlelight vigils were held annually. Community events were organized to promote safety, awareness, and support for other victims. Their parents became powerful voices for change, speaking at events, meeting with lawmakers, and ensuring that their children's memories were not lost in the noise of tragedy. They have inspired thousands, not just through their words, but through the way they carried their grief, with dignity, compassion, and unwavering resolve. But still, the loss lingers. Channon and Chris should have had decades ahead of them: careers, marriages, children, laughter, quiet Sunday mornings. Instead, their lives were stolen by people who viewed them as objects to torment. The randomness of the attack, the senselessness of the violence, and the depths of cruelty displayed have left scars that time cannot heal. And yet, amidst the horror, there is something else, something powerful. The love shared by Channon and Chris, the love their families poured into the world after their deaths, and the love of a community that refused to let them be forgotten. Their story is not just about tragedy, it is about humanity, about the strength of 2 families, about the beauty of 2 lives, and about the importance of remembering, even when the memories hurt. Today, more than a decade later, Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom are still remembered, not as victims, but as vibrant young people whose lives were filled with promise, kindness, and joy. Their story reminds us of how fragile life can be, how precious every moment is, and how, even in the face of unimaginable darkness, love and justice can endure. They deserve so much more than what they received. But because of those who loved them, their names live on, not in the shadows of their deaths, but in the light of everything they were and everything they continue to inspire. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more content like this, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.